Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we invite you to settle in and let your thoughts drift away as we step softly into one of the most beloved tales ever told. This is the story of Pride and Prejudice 2005, a timeless journey through quiet gardens, candlelit ballrooms, and the tender unfolding of two hearts that learn to understand one another. There is no need to watch the screen, just close your eyes and let the story carry you. The fireplace will crackle gently beside us, and the world outside will fade as we follow Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy across the hills of England toward understanding, forgiveness, and love. So take a deep breath, find your most comfortable place to rest, and let us begin. Once upon a quiet morning in the sleepy English village of Longbourn, the mist hung low over the fields, and the sun was just beginning to stir in the pale sky. A gentle breeze danced through the tall grass and rustled the hedgerows that lined the worn country path. Along that path walked a young woman with keen eyes and a mind full of thoughts. Elizabeth Bennet, second of 5 sisters, wandered with a book in hand, letting her feet take her wherever the morning pleased. Her boots were damp with dew, but her heart was light, content in the hush of early hours and the company of words on a page. As she made her way home, the quaint brick house of Longbourn came into view, ivy curling up its walls, smoke whispering from its chimney, and the sleepy chatter of morning just beginning inside. From outside the open window, Elizabeth could hear her parents speaking. Her mother's voice, bright and breathless, floated into the air like a bird startled from a bush. "Netherfield Park is let at last," she was saying with delight. At those words, Elizabeth smiled quietly to herself and stepped through the door. For the Bennet family, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and their 5 daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, such news was the spark that could light a fire. Their world, though small and green and tucked away, was filled with great hopes and urgent dreams. And for Mrs. Bennet, there was one dream above all: to see each of her daughters married well, ideally to a man of fortune. And now, it seemed, fortune had come close to home. A gentleman named Mr. Bingley had taken residence at nearby Netherfield Park. He was young, wealthy, and unattached. Mrs. Bennet's excitement rippled through the household like a sudden breeze, fluttering curtains, stirring hearts. Elizabeth entered the house and spotted Lydia and Kitty huddled outside the library door, clearly eavesdropping. She poked Lydia lightly in the side, scolding them in a hushed voice, reminding them what she'd always said about listening at doors. But Lydia dismissed it quickly. What mattered now, she said with excitement, was that a certain Mr. Bingley had arrived from the north. Kitty added that he didn't come alone. There was more than one chaise. And Lydia, with dramatic flair, declared he had 5,000 a year, and more importantly, he was single. Just then, Jane, the eldest of the sisters, gentle, lovely, and a touch naive, appeared beside Elizabeth and asked, "Who's single?" "A Mr. Bingley, apparently," Elizabeth replied. Kitty hushed them all with a sharp whisper and pressed her ear more tightly to the door. Lydia leaned in again, and even Jane and Elizabeth tilted closer to hear, doing their best to appear casual. Within the library, Mrs. Bennet was already in a state of breathless excitement, insisting that this newcomer must certainly marry one of her daughters. Mr. Bennet, ever amused and unbothered, teased her about her nerves and seemed more interested in tending to a potted plant than matchmaking schemes. But then, without fanfare, he casually revealed that he'd already paid the man a visit, news that froze the entire household in place. Even the piano fell silent. Mrs. Bennet was astonished. Jane looked surprised. Mary, as usual, missed the point entirely and asked vague questions. Lydia and Kitty were positively bursting with joy, barely able to contain themselves. Even Elizabeth couldn't help but smirk at the absurdity of it all. Talk of the upcoming ball quickly took over. Lydia and Kitty began arguing over who would wear Jane's spotted muslin dress, each pleading their case and offering trades. The chaos grew louder as they tugged at Jane's arms, trying to win her favour. Watching them, Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth laughed softly. The next evening, under the glow of lanterns and the sound of strings tuning up, the Bennet family attended a village ball. The assembly hall, with its wooden beams and candlelit chandeliers, was alive with laughter and gowns in soft colours sweeping across polished floors. And then everything paused. Into the room stepped Mr. Bingley, looking cheerful and sincere, joined by his elegant sister Caroline, and a tall, solemn man with dark eyes and quiet steps, Mr. Darcy. As they entered, the music faltered and every head turned. For a moment the party seemed to hold its breath before resuming again, more aware now of the newcomers. Mr. Bennet introduced his daughters, and in the flicker of candlelight something passed between Mr. Bingley and Jane. A warm glance, a smile that lingered. They began to dance, and soon they were laughing like old friends beneath the gentle rise and fall of the music. Elsewhere in the room, the youngest sisters, Lydia and Kitty, clung to each other in giddy excitement. They had just heard the news that a regiment of soldiers would be stationed nearby for the winter. Visions of officers in uniform and dashing romances filled their minds, and they couldn't wait to tell their mother, who was equally delighted. But not every heart was so light. Standing near the edge of the room, Elizabeth found herself beside Mr. Darcy. Hoping to make polite conversation, she asked if he danced. His response was cold and curt. Not if he could help it. Caroline Bingley, ever elegant but sharp, mirrored his aloofness. The two of them remained at a distance, untouched by the warmth that filled the room. Later, as the night wore on, Mr. Bingley shared with Darcy how impressed he was by Jane's beauty and character. He even encouraged Darcy to speak with Elizabeth, but Darcy, in his pride, refused, saying she was only barely tolerable. Unluckily, Elizabeth overheard every word. Her expression didn't falter, but a quiet sting settled in her chest. Still later, as candles burned low and guests lingered, Mrs. Bennet, never one to keep her thoughts to herself, began hinting at her hopes for Jane and Mr. Bingley. She reminisced about Jane's early admirers and poetry she had received at 15. Trying to put an end to her mother's embarrassing enthusiasm, Elizabeth joked that the poetry was what ruined everything. Mr. Darcy, intrigued, remarked that he believed poetry to be the food of love. Elizabeth, ever clever, replied that while such food might nourish a strong love, it could snuff out a weak one with a single poor sonnet. When he asked her what might strengthen affection instead, she gave him a knowing look and answered softly, "Dancing, even when one's partner is barely tolerable." It was clear to Mr. Darcy then Elizabeth had heard his earlier insult, and she was not willing to let it pass. Later that night, in their bedroom warmed by soft candlelight, Jane and Elizabeth whispered beneath their shared blanket. The quiet of the house wrapped around them like a quilt. Jane confessed that she truly liked Mr. Bingley, and that his wealth did not matter to her. Elizabeth, still stung by Darcy's pride, said only that she found him arrogant and rude. The next morning, the Bennet family gathered around the breakfast table, the clink of spoons and rustle of napkins nearly drowned out by Mrs. Bennet's cheerful chatter. She recounted every moment of the ball, especially the fact that Mr. Bingley had danced almost every dance with Jane. The glow in her voice made the room feel brighter. Then the sound of footsteps. One of the servants arrived with a letter. It was from Netherfield. Excitement fluttered through the room like sparrows startled from a tree. The letter was from Caroline Bingley, inviting Jane to dine at Netherfield Hall. Though Mr. Bingley would not be there, the invitation was still cause for celebration. But Mrs. Bennet saw a chance for more. When Jane asked for a carriage, her mother glanced at the sky and noticed gathering storm clouds. She insisted Jane ride on horseback instead. Surely the coming rain would force her to stay the night, and perhaps by morning Mr. Bingley would return. And so it was. The rain came down in silver sheets, and Jane arrived at Netherfield cold, wet, and shivering. By evening, her cheeks burned with fever. Mrs. Bennet's plan had worked perfectly. Jane would not be coming home that night. The rain had passed, but the air still hung heavy with mist, and the roads glistened with the memory of the storm. From the quiet warmth of Longbourn, a letter arrived on delicate paper, its ink just barely dry. Jane had written from Netherfield, her handwriting neat and careful. Mr. Bingley, she explained, had insisted she remain there until she fully recovered from the cold. The household read the news with wide eyes. Mrs. Bennet, glowing with delight, saw only opportunity. The longer Jane stayed at Netherfield, the closer she might draw to Mr. Bingley's heart. But Elizabeth felt only concern. Her sister was unwell, and the thought of her being alone in a strange house, no matter how fine, was too much to bear. So, early the next morning, Elizabeth set out on foot. Her shoes pressed into the damp path, the hem of her dress gathering mud, her cheeks pinked by the chill. Fields stretched out on either side, golden and green, and birds called faintly from the hedgerows as she walked. Step by step, she made her way across the countryside to Netherfield Park. When she finally reached the grand stone house, the air inside was still and polished, like the surface of a lake. She was shown into the dining room, where the clink of breakfast china and the rustle of starched linen had only just faded. There, seated in their elegant way, were Mr. Darcy and Caroline Bingley. Darcy looked up, and for a moment everything seemed to pause. The surprise in his eyes flickered into something unreadable as he rose at once, visibly flustered. He bowed quickly, too quickly. When Elizabeth asked after her sister, Darcy replied in a soft tone, his words coming out in a rush. Elizabeth offered a faint smile, said nothing more, and made her way upstairs, her dress still damp from the walk. Caroline's gaze followed her with disdain, lips pursed at the sight of Elizabeth's muddied skirts. But Darcy remained silent, his eyes lingering on the door where Elizabeth had disappeared, his expression difficult to decipher, like a man standing at the very edge of something dangerous and dazzling. Upstairs the room was quiet, save for the gentle crackle of a fire in the hearth and the soft rhythm of Jane's breathing. Pale but recovering well, she lay tucked under a warm quilt. Elizabeth's presence brought a flush of relief to her sister's face. She sat beside her, gently brushing back a stray lock of hair and murmuring comfort. Though Jane worried about being a burden, Elizabeth teased lightly, thinking aloud whether their mother or Mr. Bingley was more pleased that Jane would be staying longer. As if summoned by the thought, Mr. Bingley soon arrived, his face lit with warmth and nervous energy. He spoke kindly, his words fumbling over themselves in a flustered attempt to explain his pleasure at Jane's presence, though not, of course, at the illness that had brought her. His awkward phrasing made him all the more endearing. Later that day, a soft afternoon light spilled into the drawing-room. The household gathered. Elizabeth sat with a book balanced in her hands, pages turning slowly. Darcy, nearby at a desk, was writing letters with careful concentration. Bingley lounged contentedly, while Caroline, clearly bored, wandered in search of amusement. She drifted behind Darcy's chair, peering over his shoulder and remarking on how swiftly he wrote. He replied curtly, without even looking up, that she was mistaken, for he actually wrote rather slowly. Trying to flatter, Caroline asked him to pass her affections to his sister, but Darcy reminded her he had already done so, once, at her request. Elizabeth glanced up briefly from her book as Caroline gushed about a design Darcy's sister had drawn. Darcy, still focused on his letter, suggested that her raptures be postponed until he had more space to describe them properly. Conversation turned to the idea of a truly accomplished woman. Bingley, ever cheerful, marvelled at how many things women strove to perfect. Caroline chimed in quickly, listing off every trait she had cultivated: music, languages, fine dancing, graceful manners. Her voice was smooth but pointed. Then, Darcy added his own thought, quiet but firm. A woman, to be truly accomplished, must also read. At this, Elizabeth closed her book slowly, having been reading only moments before. His words rang clear. She was on his mind. She glanced up, challenging the lofty standards being casually laid out before her. With a slight arch of her brow, she remarked that she was surprised they even knew any women who fit such impossible expectations. Darcy, taken aback, said nothing at first, but the silence between them shimmered with tension. A quiet clash of thoughts and pride began to stir. Their views, his careful and exacting, hers playful but sharp, stood at odds, like two trees bending toward each other in a windstorm. Caroline, watching closely, and perhaps sensing that the room was no longer revolving around her, interrupted. She smiled too widely and invited Elizabeth to walk about the room with her, hoping perhaps to pull Darcy's gaze back to where she believed it belonged. Elizabeth rose, but her thoughts were still with the man seated by the desk, and his eyes, though guarded, followed her across the room, drawn like a moth toward light. The atmosphere hung thick with unspoken things. And the evening went on with warmth and civility, but under the surface, something had begun. The rain had passed, and Netherfield Park sat golden once again beneath the afternoon sun, the windows glowing with warmth and the scent of autumn drifting through the air. Later that day, the quiet elegance of Netherfield was stirred once more by a familiar, bustling energy. Mrs. Bennet had arrived, accompanied by her 3 youngest daughters. Laughter echoed through the entrance as Kitty and Lydia, brimming with excitement, giggled endlessly at everything and nothing. Mrs. Bennet, proud and beaming, took in the fine drawing-room and lavish halls with exaggerated praise. Her voice rang with admiration for every cushion, curtain and teacup. Kitty and Lydia, still giggling beside her, eagerly suggested that Mr. Bingley ought to hold another ball. Gracious as ever, Mr. Bingley smiled and promised he would, just as soon as Jane was feeling well enough to enjoy it. Before long, the Bennet family gathered in the front hall, preparing to return home. Jane, still pale but lovely, thanked Mr. Bingley with quiet warmth for all his kindness. He helped her into the carriage with a gentle touch, clearly reluctant to see her go. Elizabeth followed, her skirts brushing lightly against the floor. As she stepped forward, Darcy was there. Without a word, he reached out and offered his hand to help her up. Their hands met briefly, but the contact lingered, charged with something unspoken. Elizabeth, startled by the strange flutter the touch sent through her, glanced back. Her gaze met Darcy's, an unreadable expression on his face. He quickly turned away. By his side, his hand flexed slightly, as though it remembered her touch even after she'd gone. Elizabeth didn't notice. Not yet. But confusion rested quietly behind her eyes. Back at Longbourn, the house was lively with returning chatter. The smell of wood smoke curled from the hearths as the sisters shed their travelling wraps and settled back into familiar rooms. Mr. Bennet, seated in his study chair, looked up with a knowing glint in his eye. He announced that a visitor would soon be arriving, a man named Mr. Collins. The next day Mr. Collins appeared at the door. A serious man in clerical black, he bowed stiffly and spoke with great care, though often without grace. A cousin of the Bennets and heir to the Longbourn estate, he had come to visit and to seek a bride among the Bennet daughters. As the only male heir, he was to inherit all once Mr. Bennet passed. That evening at dinner, Mr. Collins praised the garden, the wallpaper, the boiled potatoes, and most of all his wealthy patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Her name came up with every other sentence, yet the family listened with barely concealed amusement. After the meal, he approached Mrs. Bennet and shared his intention to marry Jane. She gently informed him that Jane was already likely attached elsewhere. With only the slightest guidance from Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Collins redirected his intentions to Elizabeth. The next morning was bright and full of promise. The Bennet sisters, wrapped in shawls and full of laughter, walked into town to shop for ribbons. The small village streets were lined with shop windows full of silk and lace, and the girls chattered about the upcoming ball. As they strolled, they met a new face, a young lieutenant, charming and handsome, Mr. Wickham. With a warm smile and quick wit, he joined them for their walk and offered to accompany them through the village. The sisters were instantly taken with him, especially Elizabeth, who found his company both easy and delightful. But the lightness of the moment shifted when two riders appeared in the distance, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. The horses slowed, hooves soft against the dirt. Bingley greeted them kindly, explaining that he was on his way to invite the Bennets to the Netherfield ball. But Darcy, as soon as he saw Wickham, his expression darkened. Without a word, he turned his horse and rode away. Bingley offered his invitation warmly, Wickham included, and followed after. Elizabeth was puzzled. Later, as they walked, she turned to Wickham and asked gently about Darcy. He hesitated, then spoke with measured sadness. They had known each other since they were boys, he said. Wickham's father had once managed the Darcy estate, and Darcy's father had treated him like a second son. But when the elder Darcy died, the younger one had ignored his father's final wishes, denying Wickham his rightful future. As Elizabeth listened, her heart turned colder toward Mr. Darcy. In contrast, Wickham seemed even kinder, wronged and full of quiet dignity. Her interest in him deepened like roots reaching gently through soil. The day of the Netherfield ball arrived. The Bennet household shimmered with activity. Candles were lit, gowns were laid out, and laughter floated from room to room. While preparing, Elizabeth shared Wickham's story with Jane, who listened carefully, always hoping there had been a misunderstanding. But Elizabeth had already made up her mind. That evening, the ball was glittering with light and music, gowns swaying and laughter filling the golden ballroom. Elizabeth entered, eyes quietly searching the crowd, but Wickham was nowhere to be seen. Jane found her and whispered that he hadn't come. Elizabeth assumed it was likely to avoid a scene with Darcy. Not long after, Mr. Collins appeared beside Elizabeth. With determined cheer, he requested a dance. Elizabeth, ever polite, accepted. As they moved across the dance floor, Mr. Collins launched into awkward praise and odd remarks, even alluding to a future proposal. Elizabeth, stifling a laugh, kept her gaze fixed ahead, willing the dance to end. Later, while Elizabeth was with Charlotte, Mr. Darcy approached unexpectedly. He asked her for a dance, and even more unexpectedly, Elizabeth said yes. As he walked away, she turned to Charlotte in disbelief, pulling her quietly into a corner. Had she truly just agreed to dance with Mr. Darcy? Charlotte, teasing, suggested he might turn out to be quite agreeable after all. Elizabeth, half laughing, whispered that it would be terribly inconvenient, since she had already sworn to despise him forever. The two friends laughed at the thought. As they moved in tandem across the floor, a quiet tension curled between them. Their conversation was crisp but edged. When the subject of Mr. Wickham surfaced, Elizabeth couldn't help but defend him. Darcy's responses grew tight, clipped. The clash of their beliefs, their pride, their values, all of it flickered just beneath their words. By the time the music faded, Elizabeth walked away, her thoughts whirling. As the evening wore on, the dancing continued. Jane and Mr. Bingley moved together as though the rest of the room had vanished. Elizabeth watched them with gentle joy, their connection as clear as moonlight on still water. Charlotte, standing beside her, whispered a thought. Jane should speak her feelings before it was too late. Elizabeth knew Charlotte was right, but she also knew her sister's quiet nature, how feelings ran deep even if words came slow. But Charlotte argued that Bingley, for all his warmth, might never guess whether Jane was shy or simply uninterested. Dawn broke gently over Longbourn, the golden sunlight slipping between gauzy curtains and casting a warm glow across the breakfast table. Cups clinked softly, and the scent of tea and toasted bread mingled with the sound of rustling letters and sleepy chatter. Just as the Bennet family was finishing their breakfast, a quiet knock came at the door. Mr. Collins entered, unusually serious, and requested a private word with Elizabeth. Without hesitation, Mrs. Bennet sprang into action, shooing the rest of the family out of the room with flurried hands and hopeful eyes. Once alone, Mr. Collins began to speak with formal certainty. With one hand over his heart and the other extended in grand flourish, he proposed marriage. Elizabeth, taken aback but calm, politely declined. Mr. Collins, however, seemed utterly unmoved by her words. He smiled as if she had just played a coy game, convinced she meant the opposite. In his mind, no refusal could be genuine. He was, after all, so sure of his superiority and the honour he was offering. Elizabeth's refusal grew firmer. She explained with grace and honesty that they were not suited, that he could not make her happy, and that she was quite certain she could never make him happy either. But he went on, oblivious, thinking her rejections were designed to heighten his desire. Finally, her patience frayed. Her voice sharpened, and she told him plainly she was not the kind of woman who would torment a respectable man with false hope. With a final glance, she turned and walked away, leaving him kneeling, dumbfounded and humiliated, still on one knee. On the other side of the door, Mrs. Bennet had been listening eagerly. The moment it creaked open, she dashed in, flustered but determined. She assured Mr. Collins that Elizabeth would change her mind, that it was all just a matter of stubbornness and nerves. Then, in a storm of frustration, she confronted Elizabeth, pleading, insisting, and nearly begging her to reconsider. When her efforts failed, she turned to Mr. Bennet for support, but he, quiet and firm, spoke clearly. If Elizabeth did marry Mr. Collins, he said, she would lose his respect, and he would never speak to her again. Mrs. Bennet, horrified, had nothing left to say, and that was the end of it. Not long after, a letter arrived to Jane, neatly folded and sealed in blue wax. It was from Caroline Bingley. She wrote that she, her brother, and Mr. Darcy had gone to London. There was no promise of return, just a distant, polite farewell. But Jane could see more in it. She saw the truth between the lines. Bingley had left her behind. Her soft eyes filled with disappointment, though she said very little. Elizabeth, more fiery, suspected Caroline's hand in it all. She encouraged Jane not to give up hope, and suggested she visit their aunt in London. Perhaps, she said gently, fate might still intervene. Some days later, Charlotte returned to Longbourn with unexpected news. She was engaged to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth was stunned, speechless at first. Charlotte explained quietly that at 27 she could no longer afford to wait for love. She needed a home, a future, and security for herself and her family. She told Elizabeth not to judge her choice, only to understand it. Elizabeth, heart aching but respectful, said nothing more. Time passed. The seasons shifted. The trees outside Charlotte's new home bent softly in the wind, their branches bare against a cold spring sky. Elizabeth, having accepted several invitations, finally agreed to visit her old friend. One evening, while she was staying at the Collins' modest parsonage, an invitation came from Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She had asked them all to dinner. Lady Catherine's estate was grand and rigid, full of fine antiques and echoing halls. When they arrived, the drawing-room was already busy with voices. Elizabeth looked around, then froze. There he was, Mr. Darcy. He stood in the shadows at the far end of the room, still and quiet, yet unmistakably present. Her heart stuttered at the sight of him. During dinner, Lady Catherine spoke with sharp formality, asking Elizabeth endless questions about her upbringing, her family, her education. But Elizabeth answered every one with grace and quiet strength. Lady Catherine seemed both offended and oddly impressed. Later in the evening she insisted Elizabeth play the piano, and though Elizabeth agreed, she knew well the command came not from admiration, but to display her supposed inferiority. She sat before the keys, the candlelight flickering across the sheet music. And then Darcy approached. He stood near, listening, his gaze lingering not on her playing, but on her. She made a soft remark about not being intimidated by him. He replied gently that he knew her too well by now to expect anything less. A quiet smile tugged at her lips, and she played on. Just then, Colonel Fitzwilliam, Darcy's friend, joined them. He asked Elizabeth how Darcy had behaved back in her village. With a teasing smile, she told him Darcy hadn't danced with anyone at all. Darcy, a bit embarrassed, softly tried to explain himself. He wasn't unfriendly, he said. He simply found it hard to open up to strangers. There was something different in his tone now, something honest, soft, vulnerable. But Elizabeth only smiled, amused. She teased him still, suggesting that he practiced being more sociable. He didn't argue. He only watched her, as if trying to memorize the look in her eyes. The morning light spilled gently through the windows of the Collins' modest home. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Elizabeth sat quietly at the writing desk, pen in hand, carefully composing a letter to Jane. The house was hushed, save for the distant sounds of birdsong and quills scratching. But her quiet moment was soon interrupted. Mr. Darcy entered, sudden, unannounced. His steps were unsure, his face unusually pale. He stopped beside her as though he had something important to say, but the words refused to come. He opened his mouth once, then again, then fell silent. After a long pause, he offered only a stiff farewell and turned to go, leaving Elizabeth still seated at her desk, blinking in quiet astonishment. Later that day, they all gathered at church. The pews were lined with villagers in Sunday best. Darcy sat off at a distance, half shadowed by the columns, while Elizabeth sat beside Colonel Fitzwilliam. As the service came to a close, the Colonel leaned closer, speaking softly as they waited for the procession to move. He shared a casual story, one of Darcy intervening to prevent his close friend from a marriage he deemed unwise. A protective act, he'd said. When Elizabeth asked who that friend was, the answer hit like a stone dropped into still water. Charles Bingley. The Colonel spoke without hesitation, unaware of Elizabeth's connection. It had been Darcy, he said, who ensured the separation, believing the match beneath his friend. Elizabeth's breath caught, her heart sank. She could feel her blood rising. Outside, the sky had turned grey, heavy with rain. Without waiting for the others, Elizabeth stepped into the downpour. Her dress soaked through within seconds, her hair clinging to her face. She didn't care. She ran, not from the weather, but from what she had just heard. Her feet carried her without thought, splashing through puddles, until she found herself breathless and shivering beneath the shelter of a stone structure. She leaned against the cool wall, rainwater dripping from her brow, heart pounding from more than just the run. Tears threatened, but she held them back. The storm roared around her. She closed her eyes. And then, footsteps. Darcy appeared beside her, soaked just as she was, hair slick with rain, chest rising and falling with every breath. His face was pale, as if fighting a storm of his own. He looked troubled, lost, and yet resolved. He stepped closer, and his words came in a rush. He spoke of struggles, of pride, of expectations and inner torment, until at last he said what Elizabeth never expected to hear, that he loved her. Not mildly, not gently, but deeply, ardently. Elizabeth stood frozen, stunned, but the storm in her heart was louder still. She refused him without hesitation, and when he asked why, the dam broke. She told him everything, that she knew of what he had done, that he had torn Bingley from Jane, that he had destroyed her sister's happiness for no just reason, Darcy tried to explain. He claimed that Jane showed no affection, that it seemed as though she didn't even care. But Elizabeth's voice trembled as she defended her sister's nature. Jane, she said, was shy, not cold. She rarely even showed her feelings to those who knew her best. Darcy denied that money had been a factor, but there was something else. He hesitated, then admitted, awkwardly and with great discomfort, that it had been her family, the behavior of her mother, her younger sisters, and even, at times, her father. Only she and Jane were excluded from his judgment. Elizabeth flushed at the truth in his words, unable to deny it. But she wasn't finished. There was another matter, one more wound yet to confront. Mr. Wickham. Darcy's expression darkened at the name, a flicker of jealousy, then hurt, then anger. His eyes sharpened. She pressed him for answers. How could he treat someone so unfairly? How could he act with such cruelty? Darcy's patience began to wear thin. He scoffed bitterly, accusing her of believing slander over truth. But Elizabeth, filled with fury, recounted every injustice Wickham had shared with her. She accused Darcy of crushing Wickham's future, and now speaking of him with disdain. The sharpness in her voice was undeniable. Darcy's control cracked. His voice rose. He shot her words back at her, raw and full of resentment. He thanked her for making her opinion of him so perfectly clear. And then he struck where he knew it would hurt, saying perhaps she would have forgiven him if only her pride hadn't been wounded. But Elizabeth was quick to respond. She flung his arrogance back in his face, recalling how from the very start his conceit and superiority had made him the last man she could ever imagine marrying. Darcy stiffened. The blow had landed, and now there was nothing left to say. Yet they didn't move. The argument had drawn them so close that their breaths mingled in the cold air. Their faces were mere inches apart. Rain pattered against the stone roof above them, wind whistling through the open columns. The air between them crackled with tension. Though they spoke in anger, something unspoken lingered in the space between them. Their eyes locked, drifting for a heartbeat down to each other's lips, then back again. It was as if they were fighting an invisible pull, both caught in the impossible urge to close that final distance. He almost leaned in. She almost let him. A kiss hovered in the space between them, unsaid, unrealized, but so achingly near. But still, neither of them moved, neither advancing nor retreating, as the storm raged around them. And then Darcy apologized, coldly and formally, for having taken up so much of her time. One last glance at her lips, and he stepped back, turned and strode away into the rain. Left alone, Elizabeth leaned against the stone wall, stunned. Her heart pounded, her breath caught in her throat. She watched him disappear into the storm, her mind racing with everything that had just been said. and all that had not. Night had fallen over the quiet countryside, and the drawing room at the Collins home glowed with the low flicker of candlelight. Shadows stretched long across the walls, and outside the wind rustled softly through the garden hedges. Elizabeth sat alone, still and silent. Her thoughts were a tangle of memory, emotion and regret. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The storm from earlier had passed, but a new one churned quietly within her. Then the door behind her creaked open. She didn't turn, but she saw his reflection in the mirror, Mr. Darcy stepping into the room. His movements were deliberate and quiet. He placed a single folded letter on the table behind her. He stood there for a moment longer. Calmly and with controlled emotion, he told her that he would not repeat the sentiments she had found so offensive earlier, but he asked for the chance to explain the 2 accusations she had made against him, then turned and left, his steps fading into silence. Only when she was alone again did Elizabeth turn and reach for the letter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the pages. The candlelight danced across the inked lines as she began to read. What she found inside changed everything. The letter spoke of Mr. Wickham, of secrets never told. Darcy explained how his own father had cared for Wickham as a son, gifting him both education and a valuable position in the church. But Wickham refused the path set before him. Instead, he asked for a generous sum of money, £3,000, to study law in London. The request was granted, and Wickham vanished into the world of city lights and careless living. He squandered everything, and when no more money came, he severed ties. Elizabeth paused. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the last golden light of day slipped behind the trees. In the distance, she spotted Darcy on horseback, riding away into the quiet dusk. She returned to the letter. What came next left her breathless. The summer before, Wickham had returned, not to apologize, not to make amends, but to pursue Darcy's 15-year-old sister Georgiana. With charm and calculated intention, he had tried to persuade her to elope, seeking not love, but her fortune. £30,000. The scheme had nearly succeeded, but Darcy had discovered the plan in time to stop it. Elizabeth's heart sank, and then the letter moved to Jane, to the part Elizabeth dreaded most. Darcy confessed his role in keeping Bingley away. He admitted to influencing his friend, believing Jane did not truly return Bingley's feelings and fearing heartbreak. And yes, the behavior of her family had played its part. He had thought he was protecting his friend. He hadn't realized what he was breaking. The hours passed slowly. Later that night, Elizabeth still sat in the same place, the letter resting loosely in her hands. Her expression was unreadable, softened by sadness, deepened by reflection. Charlotte entered the room and stopped immediately at the sight of her. Something in Elizabeth's face had changed. Charlotte hurried to her side, concern etched into her brow. She asked if she was well. Elizabeth's voice, barely more than a whisper, admitted she wasn't sure. She was overwhelmed, not just by new truths, but by the weight of how deeply she had misjudged. Not long after, Elizabeth returned to Longbourn. She arrived just as Jane did, the two sisters quietly reunited under the soft golden sun. That evening, as the household settled for bed, Elizabeth mentioned in passing that she had run into Mr. Darcy in town, but that was all. She said no more. Time slipped by. Months passed. And with the arrival of warmer weather, Elizabeth accepted an invitation from her aunt and uncle, the gardeners, to travel with them. Their journey took them across green hills and gentle rivers, and eventually to Pemberley, Darcy's home. Elizabeth hesitated. The very idea of entering his estate made her heart race, but her aunt assured her that Mr. Darcy would surely be away. Men of his rank rarely stayed home in the summer. They arrived at midday. Pemberley stood surrounded by rolling woods and tranquil water, its grand stone facade gleaming in the sunlight. Inside, marble statues lined the halls, and velvet drapes softened the edges of high-ceilinged rooms. A gentle breeze stirred through open windows. Mrs. Reynolds, the cheerful housekeeper, guided them through each space with warm pride, describing every corner and family portrait in loving detail. Elizabeth followed, polite and quiet. But when they came upon the sculpture gallery, something inside her stilled. There, in the softest light, stood a bust of Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth stepped closer. His likeness was carved in marble, handsome, serious, and noble. Mrs. Gardiner remarked on the sculptor's skill, asking Elizabeth if it was a good likeness. Elizabeth, barely able to speak, admitted that it was. Mrs. Reynolds beamed and moved on, but Elizabeth lingered. She stared at the sculpture for a long moment, her gaze softening. Something stirred in her expression. Admiration, maybe, or longing. When she turned to speak, she realized the others had moved on without her. She wandered alone, her steps light on the polished floors. In a nearby room, music drifted through a door left slightly ajar. A piano, played with grace and fluency. Drawn in by the melody, she moved quietly toward it. Through the small opening, she saw a young girl, 16, gentle-faced, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys. Georgiana Darcy. Elizabeth paused, watching from the shadows. The music washed over her. Then someone entered the room. A tall figure moved toward the girl, his steps familiar. Georgiana leapt up, shrieking with joy, and rushed into his arms. He caught her easily, twirling her with laughter. The sunlight fell over his face. It was Darcy. Elizabeth's breath caught. In that instant he turned and saw her. Time froze. They stared at one another for a brief moment. Then, with startled instinct, Elizabeth turned and ran from the room. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, breath unsteady, cheeks burning with embarrassment. But Darcy followed. He caught up to her at the stairs. They both stopped. They bowed. Words were few, voices hushed. She explained she was only visiting, that they were leaving tomorrow. He seemed surprised, disappointed even. He asked where they were staying. She answered quietly. Then, awkward silence. Elizabeth looked away, fumbling for something to say. She apologized for seeing him with his sister, said she hadn't meant to intrude. Darcy tried to reassure her, but she was already retreating. He offered to escort her back, but she politely declined, reminding him of her fondness for walking. To which he replied that he knows. Of course he remembered. They shared a final delicate bow. And then Elizabeth turned, her skirt sweeping lightly over the stone floor, and walked away. Darcy stood there alone, watching her disappear once again. Night had settled over the countryside, casting a hush across the inn in Lambton. Downstairs, soft candlelight shimmered on polished wood, and the distant hum of voices echoed faintly through the halls. Elizabeth descended quietly, her thoughts still swirling from the events of the day. As she neared the dining room, she slowed. Something caught her attention. Through a narrow crack in the door, she spotted Mr. Darcy standing with her aunt and uncle. His tone was gentle, his words polite. He mentioned sending his carriage the following day at noon. Then, with practiced grace, he bowed and departed. Elizabeth stepped into the room moments later, stunned by what she'd just seen. Mrs. Gardner, bright with excitement, shared that Mr. Darcy had just left, and added that he had been surprisingly civil. She seemed pleased, even amused, at how different he was from the man Elizabeth had once described. Mr. Gardner agreed, remarking on Darcy's manners and generosity. And then, to Elizabeth's astonishment, they explained he had invited them all to dine at Pemberley the next day. Elizabeth repeated the words to herself, still in disbelief. Her aunt noticed the shift in her face, something quiet, thoughtful, something uncertain. There was more. Mr. Darcy had especially wished for Elizabeth to meet his sister. The following afternoon brought warm sun and a gentle breeze. A carriage rolled smoothly up the long gravel path of Pemberley. The great house stood radiant in the golden light, ivy clinging to the edges of the stone like soft embroidery. Inside, in a drawing room bathed in light, Georgiana Darcy sat at the pianoforte, As soon as she saw them, she rose, eyes wide with eager excitement. Her welcome was sincere, filled with warmth, and her smile held none of the formality often expected in households such as hers. Elizabeth stepped gently forward, unsure of what to say, but Georgiana's kindness eased the moment. Darcy stood nearby, quiet but attentive. There was something different about him now, calmer, lighter. Elizabeth's eyes moved to the instrument. She commented softly on the beauty of the pianoforte. Georgiana explained it had been a gift from her brother. She teased him gently, claiming he shouldn't have. Darcy, unruffled, replied that he absolutely should. The back and forth between the siblings was endearing. They were clearly close, and Elizabeth found herself smiling at the tenderness between them. To keep the mood light, Elizabeth made a playful remark about the evening she once played for him. Georgiana, confused, confessed that her brother had spoken highly of Elizabeth's talent. This surprised her. She looked at Darcy. He offered only a shy shrug and a smile. Elizabeth teased him again, insisting he must have exaggerated. For the first time, Darcy laughed, truly laughed. It was quiet but unguarded, and it lit his face in a way she had never seen before. He gently corrected her, saying he had only remarked that she played quite well. Elizabeth's smile lingered, and with a playful glint in her eyes she echoed his words. Quite well was certainly different from very well, she said, and declared herself satisfied with the clarification. Their laughter softened, fading into a silence that settled gently between them. But it wasn't an awkward silence. It was warm, content, and full of something unspoken. They looked at one another, eyes soft, smiles gentle. And in the tender stillness that followed, something began to bloom, a sweetness, a slow, glowing warmth neither of them dared name, but both could feel. Georgiana noticed it too. Her gaze flicked from one to the other, thoughtful and curious. Darcy then turned to Mr. Gardiner and asked if he enjoyed fishing. When Mr. Gardiner responded enthusiastically, Darcy invited him to borrow rods and fish at the lake on the property, which had long gone untouched. Mr. Gardiner was thrilled, clearly delighted by the invitation. Elizabeth watched this kindness with quiet appreciation. She looked at Darcy with grateful eyes, touched by how warmly he welcomed her family. Something had shifted. He was different now. Or perhaps she was finally seeing him clearly. Georgiana asked Elizabeth if she ever played duets. Elizabeth admitted she only did so when absolutely necessary. Georgiana, ever playful, turned to her brother and suggested he persuade her. Darcy smiled gently, and Elizabeth returned the smile, shy, sincere, and glowing with new understanding. Later that day, as the sun melted low into the horizon, the carriage rolled down the winding road from Pemberley. Darcy escorted Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle back to the inn, the quiet hum of the countryside trailing behind them like a lullaby. Back at the inn, twilight had turned to starlight. A soft hush had settled over everything. Over tea and gentle conversation, the Gardners spoke warmly of their host. Mr. Gardner, in his calm and thoughtful way, leaned toward Elizabeth and murmured that Mr. Darcy was, indeed, a fine fellow. Mrs. Gardner thanked him more openly, praising his kindness and the grace with which he'd welcomed them. Elizabeth said little, but her heart was full. Darcy was preparing to leave when a maid approached Elizabeth and handed her a letter. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from Jane. She opened it eagerly, but everything changed. The warmth of the day vanished in an instant. In the next room the Gardners sat silently, eyes dark with concern. Darcy paced, quiet but tense. Elizabeth entered, the letter trembling in her hand. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. A broken sob escaped, and she turned away crying, rushing from the room. Darcy froze, watching her go. His hand twitched at his side, aching to follow, but he did not. Elizabeth returned moments later, still crying and struggling to compose herself, but again she turned and fled. Mrs. Gardner, her eyes moist, whispered a single word to her husband. Nearly. Then Elizabeth came back once more. Her face was pale, her voice shaken. The news was devastating. Lydia was gone. She had run off with Mr. Wickham. They had vanished from Brighton, and no one knew where to. She had no money, no future. If they were not already married. Elizabeth dared not think of it. Darcy listened, every word striking deep. He murmured something quietly, blaming himself. If only he'd exposed Wickham when there was still time. But Elizabeth, her eyes wet with quiet tears, shook her head. The blame was hers too. She had not warned her family. Had she only spoken sooner, maybe this wouldn't have happened. The Gardners were stunned, unsure of the full meaning behind their conversation, but the weight of it was clear. Mrs. Gardner asked what was being done. Elizabeth explained that her father had gone to London in search of them, but she had little hope. Darcy stepped closer to her and offered his help, gently, sincerely. But Elizabeth declined. It was too late. Mr. Gardner rose, determined. He would go after them himself. Perhaps something could still be done. The family needed him. Darcy turned to go. At the doorway he paused, looked back. Elizabeth met his gaze. Then he was gone. Elizabeth returned home soon after. Longbourn had become a place of whispered fear and quiet dread. Inside, her mother wept uncontrollably, her hands shaking, her voice rising and falling in panic. Lydia had disgraced them all, she said. The family's name would be ruined. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, exhausted and pale. The night outside stretched long and uncertain, and inside the Bennet family waited, together, frightened, hoping for a miracle. A quiet breeze passed through the halls of Longbourn as the Bennet sisters gathered around a freshly arrived letter. Laughter echoed as Kitty reached for it first, her fingers eager to peel it open. Mary scolded her not to tear it open, but Jane calmly claimed it, pointing out that it was addressed to their father, written in their uncle's familiar hand. Mr. Bennet, squinting without his glasses, unfolded the letter and began reading aloud. His voice was uncertain, pausing here and there as he struggled to decipher the handwriting. But soon the words formed clearly. Lydia and Wickham had been found. The room fell still. Kitty, her voice full of urgency, asked the question on everyone's mind. Were they married? Mr. Bennet hesitated, eyes narrowing, then passed the letter to Elizabeth, who read the message more clearly. It said they would marry if Mr. Bennet agreed to settle a modest allowance of £100 a year on Lydia. That was Wickham's condition. Mr. Bennet scoffed at the sum. Of course he would agree, but he doubted that was all there was to it. No man would marry Lydia for such a small sum unless more had been promised. He guessed that his brother-in-law had offered far more. When Jane asked Elizabeth how much she thinks Wickham had demanded, Elizabeth answered quietly, perhaps even as much as £10,000 just to persuade him. From upstairs, a sudden noise interrupted the quiet. Mrs. Bennet, having heard the word married, leapt from bed, overcome with joy. She rang the bell, called for her daughters, and began planning how she would share the news with Lady Lucas. She spoke of punch and celebration, of invitations and festivities. Elizabeth quietly suggested writing a letter to thank their uncle, but Mrs. Bennet insisted it was only fair. After all, he had more money and no children. Her mind was already spinning with dreams of homes for Lydia and Wickham, plans for visits and shopping. It wasn't long before Lydia returned. She arrived with a burst of pride, her head held high, her smile wide and unbothered. A new wedding ring gleamed on her finger, and her mother enveloped her in kisses and joy. But her father remained distant. He offered only a curt bow, and Elizabeth, standing nearby, turned away in silence as Lydia boasted loudly about her recent triumphs. Wickham, now part of the family, caught Elizabeth's eye, but she refused to meet his gaze. At dinner, Lydia could not stop talking. She waved her hand to show off her ring again and declared loudly that Brighton was the place to find a husband. She told her sisters to try their luck there next. Elizabeth scolded her, but Lydia only laughed. Wickham, looking uneasy, announced his new posting. He had joined a regiment near Newcastle. Mr. Bennet responded with indifference. When Kitty asked to visit Newcastle, her father refused without hesitation. Lydia continued to chatter endlessly, oblivious to her sister's discomfort. Then, without meaning to, she let something slip. She revealed that Mr. Darcy had attended her wedding. The words hit like a thunderclap. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She questioned her. Lydia lowered her voice to a whisper, revealing that Darcy was the one who had found them, that he had made the wedding happen, that he had paid for it all, the ceremony, Wickham's commission, every last expense. She wasn't supposed to say it, but now it was said. Elizabeth stood frozen. Darcy had done all of it and never told her, not a word. The realization washed over her like a rising tide, flooding her with surprise, guilt, and something deeper she couldn't yet name. Elsewhere, far from Longbourn, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley walked together along a quiet path. Their conversation was serious, private. Bingley's expression shifted from confusion to astonishment as Darcy spoke openly, admitting what he had done, admitting how he had misjudged Jane Bennet. Back in Meryton, Elizabeth and Jane were shopping with their mother and younger sisters when they saw their housekeeper, Mrs. Hill, stepping out of the butcher's shop. She rushed toward them, breathless, bearing news. Mr. Bingley was returning to Netherfield. The words landed softly, but their effect was profound. The group fell silent. Elizabeth looked at Jane, whose eyes quickly dropped to the ground. Mrs. Bennet, flustered, tried to sound uninterested, insisting that Mr. Bingley meant nothing to them. But within moments, she circled back to ask if it was truly certain. Mrs. Hill confirmed it. He was arriving tomorrow, alone. His sister would remain in town. Mrs. Bennet was visibly stirred, though she worked hard to pretend otherwise. She waved her daughters toward the draper's shop, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Jane turned to Elizabeth with a quiet smile. She said she was glad he was coming alone, a less chance of seeing him. She wasn't afraid of her own heart, she explained, but she feared what others might say. Elizabeth studied her sister's calm expression. Brave, kind, but still wounded. At Longbourn, the day was uneventful. Mary practiced scales, Jane focused quietly on embroidery, and Elizabeth sat reading a letter. Mrs. Bennet lounged on the sofa, lazily enjoying sweets. Then, like a sudden gust of wind, Kitty burst into the room, laughing and breathless. Mr. Bingley was at the door. Panic swept through the room. Mrs. Bennet scrambled to compose herself, insisting everyone behave naturally, though no one had any idea how. She warned them not to seem too eager, even as she pinched Jane's cheeks and told Mary to stop her playing and pretend to be busy. Kitty peeked through the window and announced that Mr. Darcy was with Bingley, the pompous one, as she called him. Elizabeth rushed to the window. One look at Darcy, and her heart leapt. Just one glimpse of him, and the world around her seemed to shift. Mrs. Bennet was outraged. She could not believe he dared show his face. She muttered angrily under her breath. Then the door opened. The drawing room grew still as Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy were shown in. Bingley smiled warmly, his eyes lingering on Jane. She blushed, unable to look up. Darcy, by contrast, stood tense and formal, his expression carefully composed. Mrs. Bennet welcomed Bingley with over-the-top charm, showering him with praise and questions, but she refused to even acknowledge Darcy. She spoke of Lydia's marriage, making pointed comments about the newspaper announcement. She mentioned Wickham's new posting, dropping his name like a stone into a still pond. Darcy remained silent. To ease the tension, Elizabeth turned to Bingley, asking about his plans. He said he would remain for the shooting season. Mrs. Bennet jumped at the chance to invite him to shoot on their land. Elizabeth glanced at Darcy and asked how he was. He smiled quietly and said he was well, but added that he would be returning to town the next day. That surprised Elizabeth. So soon? Before she could ask more, Mrs. Bennet broke in again, praising Jane, drawing attention to her grace, her beauty. Then, without warning, Bingley stood and announced his departure. It was abrupt. He barely met Jane's eyes. Darcy followed, bowing politely. Mrs. Bennet called after them, reminding Bingley of a dinner invitation he had once promised. He acknowledged it, but said little else. The room fell into silence after they left. The air was thick with confusion. Kitty, unable to help herself, stifled a giggle. Jane sat perfectly still. Elizabeth turned away, heart heavy with uncertainty. The visit had come and gone like a gust of wind, leaving behind only more questions. Outside, under the pale sweep of dusk, Mr. Bingley paced restlessly along the path. His steps were uneven, his thoughts clearly tangled. Darcy stood nearby, arms folded, watching his friend's anxious circling with calm restraint. He had brought Bingley this far, but the next step, the most important one, had to be his alone. Inside Longbourn, the Bennet household buzzed with uncertainty. Kitty leaned near the window, peeking between the curtains. Jane and Elizabeth sat shoulder to shoulder in the drawing-room, their expressions unreadable. Mary wandered to the piano, her fingers idly striking slow, meandering notes. Mrs. Bennet drifted about like a restless ghost, whispering to no one in particular how strange the visit had been. Finally, Jane broke the silence. She insisted that it was for the best, that now at least things were clear. They could remain civil acquaintances, nothing more. Elizabeth tilted her head, not convinced. She teased her sister gently. Jane smiled. insisting she was in no danger of falling for Bingley again. But Elizabeth, knowing her sister's heart, warned that she might very well cause him to fall all over again. Jane, still uncertain, admitted she only regretted that Mr. Darcy had come with him. Elizabeth quickly told her not to say that. When Jane asked why, Elizabeth turned away, full of quiet guilt. "I have been so blind," she whispered. Jane stared, puzzled. Before Elizabeth could say more, the bell rang. Kitty, still at the window, gasped. It was Bingley. He had returned. The house erupted into quiet chaos. Everyone scrambled back into place, feigning calm. Just moments later, Mr. Bingley entered once more, this time alone, his shoulders squared, his nerves steady. He asked, clearly and without hesitation, if he might speak to Jane in private. For a second, time held its breath. Then Mrs. Bennet flew into action, her delight barely concealed. She ushered the rest of the family out of the room in a flurry of excitement, pausing only to press Jane's hand and beam at Mr. Bingley before vanishing. Now alone with Jane, Bingley took a breath. The first thing he said was an admission that he had been, in his own words, an unmitigated, incomprehensive ass. Jane said nothing. She simply looked at him, and as if all the emotion in the world rose up in him at once, he dropped to one knee. Outside the drawing-room, the Bennets crowded around the door, straining to hear. Kitty, Mary, Mrs. Bennet, even Mr. Bennet. All of them jostled quietly for position, holding their breath. Elizabeth stood apart, leaning against the banister. She wasn't listening. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Her heart was filled with warmth, not just for Jane, but for another. A man who had brought this moment into being. A man who had worked behind the scenes, silently mending what he had broken. A man who had changed. She smiled faintly. Without fully knowing it, she had already fallen in love with him. Back in the drawing-room, Bingley's words spilled out in a hopeful rush. He gazed up at Jane, desperate for her answer. A beat of silence. Then Jane's face lit up. She began to laugh, joyful, breathless, soft laughter, her eyes glistening with tears. She said yes, yes, 100 times, yes. At that moment, the double doors burst open. The Bennet family tumbled inside, unable to wait a moment longer. Congratulations and laughter filled the room as Jane and Bingley stood together, glowing. Later, as the sun climbed and the house fell quiet, Elizabeth found herself alone beneath a tall tree in the garden. She sat in the soft grass, her gaze lifted to the sky, lost in thought. The warm air was still, and somewhere in the hush, Darcy's presence lingered, though he was miles away. That night, in the gentle hush of the bedroom, Jane and Elizabeth sat side by side beneath the glow of a candle. Jane was radiant. She turned to her sister and wondered aloud, half laughing, half serious, whether a person could die of happiness. She told Elizabeth that Bingley hadn't known she'd even been in town last spring. He'd thought she didn't care. Jane now suspected almost with no doubt that he had been poisoned by his pernicious sisters. Elizabeth laughed at the idea. It was the harshest thing she'd ever heard Jane say. Jane laughed and turned her gaze upward. She said she only wished Elizabeth could know the same joy, that someone like Bingley might love her just as deeply. Elizabeth smiled and fell quiet. Her mind wandered elsewhere, to a man with quiet eyes and a solemn smile. To Darcy. Suddenly the night was disturbed by the clatter of wheels outside. A carriage. A moment later, a loud knock echoed through the house. Downstairs, the family, now gathered by candlelight, moved to the front door in confusion. Mr. Bennet opened it, and standing there, proud and pale as marble, was Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She swept inside without a word of greeting, her sharp eyes glinting in the dim light. She glanced around, unimpressed. She referred to the girls as the rest of your offspring, and when Mrs. Bennet tried to make polite conversation, mentioning Jane's engagement, Lady Catherine ignored it entirely and complained about the smallness of their garden. Mr. Bennet, unsure what to say, offered her tea. She refused. She turned to Elizabeth and announced with cold determination that she required a private audience. Alone in the parlour, lit by a single flickering lamp, Lady Catherine's tone became severe. She had heard a troubling rumour that Elizabeth meant to marry her nephew, Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth stared, stunned. Lady Catherine pressed, demanding to know whether Darcy had proposed. Elizabeth refused to answer. She had no obligation to explain herself. The woman bristled. She claimed Darcy was already promised to her daughter. The arrangement had existed since childhood. Elizabeth, she said, had no right to interfere, especially not with her low connections and her family's disgrace. But Elizabeth stood her ground. If Darcy was engaged, then Lady Catherine had nothing to fear. When asked to promise never to accept a proposal from him, Elizabeth refused. Her pride had been wounded enough, and this conversation, this insult, was more than she would bear. She ended it there. Throwing open the door, Elizabeth found her family waiting in stunned silence. Lady Catherine swept past them, scandalized, her steps echoing through the house like thunder. Elizabeth, trembling, turned to go. Mr. Bennet asked quietly what had happened. She told him only that it was a misunderstanding. Mrs. Bennet called after her, but Elizabeth, exhausted, simply asked, just that once, to be left alone. And so the family stood, quiet and confused, watching her climb the stairs and vanish into the night. That night, Elizabeth could not sleep. Her thoughts stirred and turned like leaves in a restless wind. Lady Catherine's visit still echoed in her ears, and with it came a tide of clarity, reflection, and emotion she could no longer keep at bay. Quietly she slipped from her bed so as not to wake Jane. Wrapping her father's old greatcoat around her nightdress, she padded barefoot through the shadowed halls of Longbourn. Downstairs, she sat alone at the table, lit only by the soft, wavering glow of a single candle. The flame fluttered, then faded. She sat in the dark. Outside, the sky began to change. That pale, early green that comes just before dawn crept along the horizon. The birds had not yet begun their morning chorus. The world was holding its breath. Compelled by the quiet beauty of the hour, Elizabeth stepped outside. Mist clung low across the fields. The air was cool and damp, and every leaf was tipped with dew. Elizabeth wandered past the garden gate, walking farther than she meant to, her thoughts miles ahead of her steps. The morning light was slow and silvery. Then, through the lifting mist, she saw a figure and stopped. At first, just a shadow through the mist, moving slowly across the field. But as he drew nearer, the shape became clear, tall, familiar, and Elizabeth's heart faltered. It was him, Darcy. He looked worn, his face unshaven, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, his coat softened by the damp morning air. And yet, in every step he took toward her, there was a quiet tenderness that made her breath catch. They stood still for a moment, staring at each other beneath the waking sky. And then, barely above a whisper, Elizabeth admitted that she hadn't been able to sleep. Darcy nodded. Nor had he. He took a small step forward and spoke of his aunt. Elizabeth nodded. Yes, she had come. Darcy's voice softened with shame. How could he ever make amends for such behavior? But Elizabeth shook her head. After everything he had done, for Lydia and perhaps even for Jane, it was she who felt the need to make amends. Darcy looked at her then, deeply and fully. The softness in his gaze was unlike anything she had ever seen in him. Quietly, he told her the truth. He had done it all for her. She stood silent, breathless, as he stepped just a little closer, his voice uncertain but full of longing. He explained that, after speaking with his aunt, a fragile hope had taken root in him, one he dared not fully believe. And so, if her feelings remained unchanged since that day in April, she need only say so, and he would never trouble her again. She still said nothing. He searched her face, and seeing something in her eyes that gave him courage, he continued, the words spilling like warm light from his soul. He told her that if her feelings have changed, he will have to tell her that she had bewitched him, body and soul, that he loved her deeply and wholly, and that from this day on he never wished to be parted from her again. Elizabeth gazed up at him, her expression soft and full of light. She took a quiet step forward. Slowly, gently, she stepped forward, bridging the final space between them. "Well then," she said softly, as she reached for his hand, lifting it gently to her lips and pressing a delicate kiss to his knuckles, then held it between both of her hands as if to warm it. She looked up at him, her eyes full of quiet acceptance. She spoke in a voice barely louder than the breeze. "Your hands are cold," she whispered. Darcy, overcome, gave the faintest nod, as if the last weight on his heart had finally lifted. He drew her close. She stepped willingly into his arms, and he wrapped them around her like a shelter from the world. With a tender sigh, he touched his forehead to hers, and in that still moment beneath the waking sky, they simply held each other, calm, quiet, and utterly content. The sun rose slowly behind them, brushing the hills in gold. The mist faded, and beneath that awakening sky, Elizabeth and Darcy held each other, silent, warm, and utterly at peace. At the Bennet household, a quiet tension filled the air. Mr. Darcy had come, with Elizabeth, to speak privately with Mr. Bennet. Now Elizabeth waited outside the library, pacing with nerves, unable to sit still. Her heart pounded as she imagined what the two men might be saying inside. At last, the door creaked open. Darcy stepped out. He gave Elizabeth the faintest, almost fragile smile. Elizabeth moved past him and stepped into the library. Her father sat there in a stunned daze. He turned to her bewildered and asked if she had lost her senses. He reminded her, had she not hated the man? Elizabeth, her voice low, told him no. Mr. Bennet leaned back in disbelief. Darcy, he admitted, was certainly rich, and no doubt she would have finer carriages than even Jane. But would any of that bring her happiness? Elizabeth, choosing her words carefully, asked him if his only objection was based on her supposed indifference. He assured her it was. The man was proud and unpleasant, certainly, but if she truly liked him, that would be enough. That's when the emotion in Elizabeth broke through. Her eyes brimmed with emotion. She confessed, barely able to get the words out, that she did like him. More than that, she loved him. He wasn't proud at all. She had been completely wrong about him. Her father didn't know the real Darcy, not truly. If only she could explain all he had done. Curious now, Mr. Bennet asked what exactly the man had done. Outside the house, on the lawn, Darcy paced restlessly, pausing now and then to glance up at the window. Inside, the Bennet women watched from another window, murmuring and whispering about how mistaken they all were. Back in the library, Mr. Bennet, surprised, insisted on repaying Mr. Darcy, but Elizabeth shook her head, urging her father not to tell anyone. Darcy would never want credit for what he had done. He had helped, not just with Lydia, but with Jane too, and she had been wrong about him in so many ways. She laughed breathlessly, eyes bright with tears, as she confessed how stubborn they both were, how alike they truly were. She and Darcy had both made mistakes, both been proud and foolish, but somehow through it all, they had found each other. Mr. Bennet studied her closely. He saw something in her expression, something that made everything clear. Emotion rising quietly behind his eyes, and with a soft chuckle he asked her, "You really do love him, do you?" Elizabeth nodded, her smile trembling. "Very much." After a long pause he sighed, a slow, smiling sigh of surrender. Tears welled in his eyes. He admitted he could hardly believe anyone might deserve her, but clearly he had been overruled. With a warm smile, he gave his full and happy consent. Overcome, Elizabeth rushed forward and embraced him, tears glistening at the edges of her smile. She pressed a kiss to his forehead and whispered her thanks. And as she reached the door to leave, he called out with a twinkle in his voice, if any young men came calling for Mary or Kitty, they were to be sent in at once. He was quite at leisure now. Elizabeth laughed and left the room, glowing with joy. Time passed, and upon the peaceful hills of Pemberley sat Elizabeth and Darcy side by side, wrapped in the warm stillness of a late summer evening. The lake stretched below them, its waters turning to gold in the candlelight that flickered softly along the garden paths. The grass bent gently in the breeze. Elizabeth's hair was loosely pinned, tucked into the collar of her coat. Darcy sat beside her, his shirt sleeves rumpled, a soft light resting in his eyes. He gently leaned in and asked her how she was that day, his voice soft and adoring. She smiled, saying she was well, though she teased him gently not to call her "my dear," explaining that it was what her father said when he was cross with her mother. Darcy, amused, asked what endearments he was allowed. She thought for a moment. Lizzie for every day, my Pearl for Sundays, and Goddess Divine reserved only for the most special occasions. Then he asked, if ever he was cross, should he call her Mrs. Darcy? She shook her head, forbidding it. He could only call her Mrs. Darcy, she said, when he was entirely, perfectly, and incandescently happy. At those words he softened completely, a gentle smile blooming across his face. She gave him the same. He took her face tenderly in his hands, looked into her eyes and whispered it. Mrs. Darcy, again and again, between a flurry of kisses on her cheeks, her forehead, her nose. She glowed with laughter, letting the sound of his love wrap around her like a second coat. And at last he leaned in, and they share a kiss, gentle, steady, full of peace. The candlelight flickers on. The night folds gently around them, and the story closes not with fanfare or flourish, but with love, quiet and lasting like the first light of morning. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, you're always welcome to return. There are many more tales to dream through, waiting just beyond the next page. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well.